Hello, and welcome to the next our series of brief gems of the Alshich. And it's quite interesting here, exciting. We've moved on to a new book in the Torah, the book of Bamidbar, Numbers in English. And here I'll read to you from the Art Scroll so we know what we're talking about. V'yidaber Hashem el Moshe, and Hashem speaks to Moshe, Bamidbar Sinai, in the desert of Sinai, Be'oil Moed, in the tent of the assembly, in the Mishkan. Be'echod lechodesh hasheni, in the first of the second month, B'shon hashenis, in the second year. L'sitzim Mitzrayim, the Jewish people went out from Egypt, Lemor, and he said, and then it says, Su'u Yisrosh Kol B'nai Yisrael, which is translated as number or count, which is where the book in English gets its name. Although that's not actually what the commentators say the word Su'u means, but we'll have to leave that for another time. The Alshich is more exercised, initially anyway, over the strange wording of this beginning verse. And I'll read to you three of his questions, and you get a feel of what is going on. So he says, question number one, Lama Hodionim Mokim Amira. Why does it tell you where God spoke to him? Let's remind ourselves. God spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai. Well, again, the Alshich, as I think you will have picked up from now, has got a great sense of humor. And his question is, well, who doesn't know where they are? It doesn't have to say that they were in the desert of Sinai. We know that. That's where the book took place. It wasn't New York or California or Scotland. So why does it have to say that? Now remember, nothing in the book, nothing in the Torah is extra. So therefore there has to be a significance to that. Why state the blindingly obvious? The second question, Amr ba'al Moed. God spoke to him from the Oil Moed, the tent of the assembly, in the Mishkan. Well, we know that as well. I mean, looking back through the previous parts of the Torah, from the giving of the Torah, that's where God spoke to him. So again, that seems to be redundant and a waste of print, waste of ink, and God doesn't waste ink. Then it says, Be'echod l'chodesh hasheni, the first of the second month, in the second year of the Jewish people going out from Egypt. Why does it emphasize exactly, precisely the time? So the Alshich says something which is very, very important. He says it's emphasizing it was the second year, second month of the second year, to emphasize that a whole year has passed since the making of the golden calf. In order to not repeat the mistake, or rather, not repeat the circumstances that led to the golden calf. And here he says what those circumstances are, and it's going to be very surprising. The reason that the Jewish people blew it at the giving of the Torah, or after the giving of the Torah, and made the golden calf, was because the whole process of transition from being a slave nation who had spent 210 years, slave experience, absorbed, sucking in all the idolatrous perspectives of Egypt, and indeed, remember, that Egypt was full of our idolatry, not just the Egyptians' idolatry. The Jews had been completely contaminated by Egyptian culture. To shake that off was a process that required the dramatic and miraculous events of the Exodus and the plagues that everybody knows about. But then a further 7 weeks between the journey from Egypt till they came to the mountain called Sinai. But that wasn't enough. It was still too much, too soon. It overwhelmed them and caused the golden calf. As a consequence of that, God doesn't want a repeat of the process, and therefore he gets them ready over a much longer period of time. This is the second year. So it's the first of the second month in the second year. So let me say there's now an entire year has passed between the Exodus, or longer than a year, between the Exodus and what comes next. In order they won't make the same mistake that they did before. Well, there's rather an obvious question hovering here. If it was too soon, if God gave the Torah to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai too soon, why did he do that? He would know the consequences. God looks into the future, and as I've told you 1,000 times, well, not 1,000 times, but many times, there's only one word that does not occur in the vocabulary of the Almighty, and that word is oops. Hashem doesn't make mistakes. The Almighty can't make mistakes. And even if you wanted to imagine naively that he could, then obviously as he can look into the future, he would see that it was a mistake and then he wouldn't make it in the first place. But Hashem doesn't make mistakes. So therefore bringing them out, even though the abruptness of the process of the transition from one state, slaves, to standing on Mount Sinai would be too quick and lead to the making of the golden calf, he still did it. But it's an oops, isn't it? No, it's not an oops. That means he meant them to fail? And again, the Alshich says, and here's a big surprise, actually, yes. You see, if it is the case that you live in a generation, and perhaps we could even talk about our own generation, where you look around at the state of the Jewish people and you despair, you see so many Jews who have turned their back on Judaism and indeed embracing the position of the enemies of the Jewish people, who are so assimilated, and you think, well, God's not going to help us. I mean, we're so awful, which of course is exactly how the Jews looked upon themselves in Egypt. God's not going to take us out from Egypt. Egypt's full of our idols. You might repeat the exact same analysis of our state today, and therefore despair that God would ever do anything that could, benefit this people who have been so disloyal. You're supposed to remember the golden calf, the going out from Egypt, the 7 weeks, when we blew it, we reached the highest spiritual level, boom, and then we blow it and make the golden calf. And God still forgave us, and Hashem still forgave us. It's the same concept when the Alshich quotes this that leads you to look back at the story of King David. King David and the story of Bathsheba, which is a very complicated story, and the world thinks that he made a mistake, but really a careful critical analysis of the Torah, or rather of the story and the Torah's perspective on it, will show a totally different story, and it ultimately didn't do anything wrong, but the world thinks he did. Why did Hashem allow that to happen? Why didn't he protect David Melech from this story, being involved in this story? And the answer is, because any individual in any future generation, that maybe the individual is you, and certainly me, when we get it wrong, and certainly I do, and have done, and probably will do, when we get it wrong and then beat ourselves up in despair and feel so useless and such a joke as a Jew, in my case as a rabbi, and you think, oh, God can never forgive me for that. Well, he forgave David, King David, for the thing he did wrong, which resonates and echoes through the history of the big Chilul Hashem, the profaning of God's name when King David got involved in the story of Bathsheba. So both incidents God allowed to take place, very complicated story, but ultimately allowed to take place, so that if you live in a generation in which the Jewish people are so collectively at such a low level, you think, oh no, we'll never get out of and would have thought we'll never get out of this. We did get out of this, and therefore in your generation, even if you think the same thing of your generation, look back to the story of the golden calf. Hashem forgave us for that. If you as an individual made a mess of your life, and it can be big and massive, it wouldn't be as massive as the Chilul Hashem, the failure perceived by the world of David Melech, and still Hashem forgave him for that. So that's why it says here, that's what this story's here. It tells you it was in Bamidbar Sinai, to remind us of the story of Sinai and the golden calf. And it was in the Ohel Moed, God spoke from the holiest place. And exactly when, the date in such minute detail, is to remind you of the fact that this next stage, this onward stage of the journey of the Jewish people, was predicated on the fact that now the transition from stage A, Egyptian slave, to stage B, carrying the message of the Torah and God to the world, that was now a much longer period of time in order that we wouldn't get it wrong, or we wouldn't be forced to get it wrong again. God didn't make a mistake in allowing us to get it wrong in the first time. He did so that we would be encouraged when we despair in any future generation by looking back at the generation that should have been the greatest, that fell most dramatically and still were forgiven. And that leads us also to think of as individuals, that King David, who was one of the greatest of all times, and fell dramatically, was allowed to fall dramatically, and was forgiven, because Hashem wanted us to know that we can make mistakes and move on. We wish you all a very good Shabbos, and it's also Shabbos and Shavuos. We wish you all a good Yontiv, a Chag Sameach.